The candle is burning low. I can see how the wax pools and then cools, gathering in quiet ridges on the table like a river slowed by its own memory. I've lit only this one, though I have more. I don't need much light anymore, just enough to find the page, enough to see the edge of the knife I no longer carry, enough to steady a hand that once didn't tremble. They say men like me don't speak at the end. That we simply vanish like smoke, like dust brushed off a cloak, but I'm tired of vanishing. I've done it too many times. And now, as Rome rumbles above and the streets fall silent one by one, I've decided to leave something behind, a trace. A shadow with words. If you are awake tonight, if sleep has curled away from your mind like a leaf recoiling from cold, then maybe these pages were meant for you. Maybe you'll be the only one who ever hears this voice. That's enough for me. I only need one. I was never a monster, though I suppose I've done monstrous things. No child is born knowing where to hide a blade or how many breaths a man takes before death. Those lessons come later and not all at once. They arrive like a dripping faucet. A whisper, a favor asked in exchange for bread. A coin placed in your palm for doing nothing more than watching someone disappear. I was shaped, bent, not broken. Forged like a coin from filthy ore, struck and passed around until the image wore down, until no one remembered what I was meant to be. Let me start here, with the candle. It's not special, just a stub I bought from an old woman who sells them outside the temple of Janus. I wonder if she knew who I was, if the curl in her smile meant something. Probably not. Most people don't look too closely at men like me. We teach them not to. Still, I chose this candle with care, beeswax, clean burn, no scent to betray its flame. It reminds me of the ones they used in the Senate's secret chambers, where deals were made over wine and names whispered like prayers no one dared repeat. I watched a lot of candles go out in rooms like that, and when they did, sometimes someone didn't leave. It's strange, the things we remember. I don't recall my mother's face clearly, only the way her hand felt when she pressed it against my chest to quiet me. I remember the pressure, not the warmth. Isn't that odd? We carry pressure longer than affection, the weight of things, the silence after. I am writing this now because I know there is no mourning for me, not truly, not the kind of mourning where bread is fresh and people argue over water jars. Rome does not forgive those who go off script, even if they helped write it. My usefulness has thinned. My name, what's left of it, is being passed around again, this time not in confidence, but in warning. Soon, someone younger, hungrier, more obedient will come, and I won't stop him. I won't try. You see, I'm not afraid, not really. There's a kind of peace that comes when you realize you've outlived your story. When the lines you were meant to say have all been spoken and everything else would just be noise. Still, I want to tell this. Not for redemption, gods know I never believed in that, not for forgiveness either. I wouldn't know what to do with it, but perhaps for memory, a different kind of remembering, not the public statues and laurels. No, a quiet kind. A whisper in someone else's dusk. If you stay with me through this, I will tell you what Rome never taught, not the glories of conquest or the rhetoric of orators, but what it was like to be the blade beneath the toga. The pause in the sentence, the hand that opened doors by closing eyes. You should know something about how I look now, not because it matters, but because it helps. My back aches, I walk like my bones are misaligned. My hands are dry and cracked, though they were once called elegant. I used to keep them soft always. It helped with the grip. Now the skin splits if I bend them too quickly. There's no poetry in age, just facts. My tunic is simple, clean but old. It smells of oil and ink. I've not worn armor in years, haven't needed to. When your enemies think you're already dead, the world becomes oddly kind. The house I'm in isn't mine. I rent the back room from a widow who doesn't ask questions. Her son left for the legions 3 springs ago. She hasn't heard from him since. We don't talk much, but sometimes she leaves figs by my door. I eat them slowly, one at a time, as if they might run out forever. This room is quiet, mostly. the kind of quiet that presses into your ears until you're sure you've gone deaf. But tonight, I swear I hear things, not footsteps or voices, those I'd recognize instantly. No, what I hear is memory shifting like sand, faces turning in shadow, a boy's laughter cut short, the hiss of blood on marble. I don't flinch anymore. The past comes when it wants. I've learned to let it. There are papers beside me. I've torn them from ledgers, borrowed from libraries I once snuck through with other motives. The ink is good and my stylus steady for now. I will write until the candle gives out, and when it does, I will stop. Whatever is unfinished will remain that way. There's a beauty in incompleteness. You don't owe every piece of yourself to the world. Are you still listening? Still here? Then thank you. That's more than most have offered me in years. This is not a tale of revenge, nor of heroism. If you're waiting for a twist, a revelation, I won't promise one. I have no tidy morals to offer, just moments, flecks of truth in a basin of lies. But that's what Rome was, really. A mask. A dance. A machine of gears and gears beneath silk and speech. And men like me, we were the oil. Invisible, necessary, discarded. No statues, no names carved into triumphal arches, just silence, but not tonight. Tonight I speak. Before you judge me, let me tell you how it really was. If you find yourself awake still, stay a little longer. There are secrets only the dying dare share. The Subura was not the Rome they put on coins. It didn't gleam with white marble or echo with the voices of senators. It groaned, always groaned, under its own weight. Narrow alleys that twisted like spilled intestines, stacked homes that leaned as if holding each other up from falling. Noise was our weather, constant, shifting, never gentle. I was born there, somewhere between the screams of a woman in labor and the bark of a dog chasing rats. No one remembers which day exactly. My mother said it rained, not a cleansing rain, but the kind that thickens the streets into mud and filth. That tracks across thresholds and refuses to leave your sandals. She was a washerwoman, not because she loved water, but because the job didn't ask for a man's strength. Just fingers, patience, and a willingness to bleed into the work. She washed tunics stiff with sweat, robes stained with wine and worse. My earliest memories are of her hands, red, raw, wrinkled before their time, scrubbing until her knuckles swelled. She never complained, only muttered the names of the clients as if cursing them gave her back some power. My father. Well, some men are present only by the holes they leave. He might have been a soldier, or a sailor, or one of the many who vanished into the night after whispering sweet lies to girls with tired feet and hopeful hearts. I used to imagine him a hero, glorious, tragic, forever on his way home. That fantasy died the day I saw another boy struck by a stranger who called himself father. I decided then that missing was better than cruel. Life in the Subura didn't come in lessons, it came in instinct. I learned to run before I learned to speak, not for joy, there was little of that, but for escape. From dogs, from drunks, from falling tiles, and once from a man who thought my neck would fit his rope nicely for stealing his bread. We stole often. Everyone did. A fish tail here, a coin from a distracted merchant there. If your hands were quick, you ate. If not, you watched others chew and pretended your hunger was a choice. I got good with my hands. Light, silent, forgettable. I was the shadow that followed real people, and no one misses a shadow. There was a butcher named Calvus who once caught me lifting a fig from his stall. I was 8. He grabbed me by the wrist, hard enough to make my fingers uncurl on their own. But then something strange. He looked at me, really looked, and let go. Told me to come back at dawn if I wanted to learn how to sharpen knives. I never did. I didn't want honest work. I wanted escape. The streets smelled of everything and nothing at once. Bread, urine, charcoal, wet stone, cheap wine, the occasional perfume from an upper-class woman passing through with her litter closed tight. We didn't look up when they went by. Looking up made you visible. Visible made you vulnerable. And yet, there was beauty in that place, in the rhythm of it. The way old women haggled like gladiators, or how boys dared each other to leap over gutters that reeked like open wounds. The way sunlight slipped through broken tiles and painted golden bars across the walls. Rome, from the ground, didn't feel eternal, but it did feel alive. My first real fight wasn't over money or food, it was over a stray dog, scrawny thing. Someone had thrown a stone at it, and I shoved the boy who'd done it. He swung back, broke my lip. I don't remember winning, but I remember not losing. That was enough. That was always enough. At night, the walls of our insula creaked like old men with secrets. You could hear everything: lovers, arguments, snores, prayers. Once, someone died upstairs and no one noticed for 2 days. The smell told us before the silence did. I slept beside my mother until I was nearly 10, not from affection, though I'm sure she loved me, but because there was only one room and no safety in distance. We shared a blanket sewn from scraps, and she used to hum songs that had no words. I think they were older than she was, maybe older than Rome itself. The gods, if they lived in our part of the city, kept their eyes closed. We had small shrines, dusty with disuse. I used to steal oil from the feet of household lairs just to light a stolen lamp. I never felt punished for it. I figured the gods had bigger sins to worry about than a boy afraid of the dark. School, that was for the sons of merchants and officials. I learned my letters by watching graffiti. Lewd things, mostly, but clever. Rome's humor was as sharp as its blades. Later, I would come to appreciate the economy of wit, how a single scratched line could mock power, invite laughter, or mark the place where someone bled. The only book I ever held as a child was a lost ledger I found in the gutter. I liked the feel of the pages, even if I couldn't read them yet. It felt important, like holding a secret. I tore out a few sheets and used them to wrap stolen figs. It felt poetic in a way I couldn't explain. There was a girl once, small, quick, louder than she should have been. Her name was Livia. She could spit farther than most boys and once bit a soldier who tried to grab her. We were friends in the only way children in the Subura could be, laughing one moment, ignoring each other the next. She disappeared one winter, just gone. People said she'd been taken by slavers. Others said her mother sold her. I never found out the truth. I stopped asking after the third time someone hit me for it. That was when I began to understand. Silence was armor, not the kind that clangs and shines, but the kind that keeps your name from being whispered by dangerous mouths. I stopped running with packs, started moving alone, watched more than I spoke. I watched hands mostly, how they moved, what they held, who they pointed at. I never learned to read the stars, but I could read a man's fear by the twitch of his hand. That talent kept me alive, more than once. And in Rome, staying alive was the first and sometimes only skill you needed. You might wonder how a boy like that becomes what I became, but the truth is I already was. Rome didn't turn me into a ghost, it just gave me places to haunt. I was 15 when I first saw the inside of a senator's carriage, not as a passenger, of course, but from underneath. The axle was greased, the wood sturdy, the scent of cedar unmistakable. That day, the rains had slowed the streets, turning even the noble quarter into a field of sluggish carts and restless horses. I wasn't looking for trouble, just a coin purse. Or perhaps a pouch of dates, something sweet to remind me what joy used to taste like. The carriage had stopped outside the baths. Its curtains were drawn, its guards distracted. I thought I saw my chance. I moved like I always had, soft soles, shallow breath, heart steady. I reached for the hanging satchel behind the driver's bench, fingers curling around the string. And then a hand gripped my wrist. Not a rough hand, no barked command or strike to the jaw, just fingers, cool, firm, deliberate. "You're better than most," said a voice. Low, dry. The kind of voice that didn't belong to soldiers or merchants. The kind that came from libraries or temples or places with locked doors and soft-spoken threats. I didn't struggle. I froze. "Stand up," he said. I did. He wore robes too fine for the mud underfoot, dark red, with subtle embroidery that shimmered like ink in candlelight. His hair was oiled, his beard close trimmed. He looked at me the way a man might study a blade, not judging its appearance but its balance. "Would you like to be paid for what you already do?" He asked. I didn't understand, not fully, but I nodded. The next day I met him again, this time in a shaded courtyard behind a bakery that never seemed to open. He asked no questions about my past, offered no name. Instead, he handed me a single task. "Follow that man," he said, pointing to a figure in a green toga walking toward the forum. "Do not be seen, do not get close. Return before sundown and tell me what he bought, who he spoke to, and if he scratched his left arm more than twice." It felt like a game, but I was good at games, and so I played. By dusk, I returned with my report. The man had bought olives and wine. He spoke to a woman selling scrolls and nodded to a passing guard. He scratched his left arm once, absently, just after speaking to the woman. The stranger, my new teacher, I suppose, smiled faintly. He didn't say well done, just we'll try again tomorrow. And we did, again and again. For weeks I followed men and women across Rome's winding arteries. I learned to vanish, to blend in. To wear the face of a servant, or a courier, or a mute boy with nothing behind the eyes but hunger and dust. I became a student of movement, of posture, of breath. Killing didn't come until later. They ease you into that, you see. At first it was poisons, powders to mix with wine, oils that burned when touched. I tested them on rats, sometimes on stray dogs. I hated that. But I understood the lesson. Death is more obedient than pain. You control the dose, the moment. A knife is loud, a mistake, but a drop, that's almost polite. Then came the blades. Short, thin, curved slightly inward, designed not to slice, but to enter and stay. I trained with them alone, mostly at night, practicing on sacks of sand or rolled cloth. Learning how to move without tension, how to hold the breath right before the strike, not out of fear, but to steady the muscles. My teacher never praised, he corrected, always with precision, never cruelty. "You breathe too high in your chest," he once said. "That gives you away. Breathe from your stomach, like singers do." He spoke Latin like a scholar, Greek like a poet, and sometimes whispered in tongues I couldn't place. I listened to everything, not just his words, but his silences. They taught me the most. We had no name for what we were. No brotherhood, no oath, just tasks. Deliver this, watch that, remove him, silence her, always quiet, always unseen. I remember my first kill. Not with pride, not with regret either, just clarity. It was a merchant, fat, nervous, always sweating. He had been selling secrets to someone across the sea, not important what, not to me anyway. I waited in his courtyard beneath a fig tree, the leaves trembling with every breeze. When he came out to piss, I stepped behind him. My blade entered below the ribs, angled up. He collapsed before he could call out. I held him as he died, more for balance than mercy. His last breath smelled of fish and sour wine. Later, I washed in the Tiber and went to sleep in a stranger's doorway. No one looked at me, no one ever did. That was the true power, not invisibility, but indifference. Rome has too many faces to notice a quiet one. I became a tool, not a man. I had coins, a place to sleep, fresh tunics, even wine when I wanted it, but no name, no story, just function. Efficiency became my religion. Every footstep measured, every glance practiced. I could pass for a slave, a freedman, a scribe, a priest. I could wear another man's habits like a second skin, and no one ever looked twice. Except one time. In the forum, years later, I passed a girl selling herbs. She met my eyes and didn't flinch, didn't look away, just held my gaze for a breath longer than comfort allowed. That single moment rattled me more than any blade ever had. I left quickly, didn't look back. Not long after, I asked my teacher, still unnamed, still unreadable, if what we did mattered. If the Republic knew our faces, if we were remembered. He said, when a man falls, they always blame the blade, never the hand that gave it, and never the voice that whispered now. I never forgot that. Have you ever wondered how many hands truly hold the dagger when one man falls? If you're still listening, you're closer to the answer. The first thing I learned was not how to kill, it was how to wait. Not the kind of waiting you do in line for bread or under an awning while the rain stutters down. No, this was a different kind of waiting. The kind where time stretches so thin it stops being time at all, just breathe and stillness and the pulse you feel behind your eyes. I remember sitting in a market stall for 6 hours once, just watching a single doorway. The man I was told to follow never appeared, but I stayed, because that was the lesson. You don't move until you have to. You don't act just because the silence feels heavy. You wait until the silence tips over. Patience, I came to understand, is sharper than any blade. My training took place in corners. In the backs of temples, behind closed atrium doors, down alleyways where the sun forgot to shine. There were no crowds cheering, no medals waiting at the end, just repetition. Listening, walking, stopping, again, again, again. Have you ever tried to hear something that doesn't want to be heard? There is an art to it. You have to empty yourself. Let your own thoughts flatten. Only then can you begin to hear everything else. The soft tap of a sandal on wet stone, the creak of a leather strap, the breath that catches ever so slightly before someone lies. Rome is a city full of noise. But underneath that noise is a current, and once you learn to find it, everything becomes visible. I practiced breathing until I could slow my heart at will. I practiced blinking, yes, blinking, so I could avoid the instinctive stutter that betrays surprise. I practiced standing still for so long that stray cats began to curl around my ankles, mistaking me for a statue. When people think of assassins, they imagine speed, precision. But what no one tells you is that speed is useless if you arrive too early. So I learned to become background. At parties, I was the silent servant, always just outside the glow of the torchlight. I refilled cups without being asked. I removed plates before anyone noticed they were empty. I listened to names, alliances, bribes, threats, all while my eyes stayed low and my steps quiet. One senator even praised my loyalty to his guests. He never realized I worked for his enemy, that I was only there to mark the shape of his world. Before it ended, clothing became another form of camouflage. You can't wear silk and expect to go unnoticed. But cheap wool, rough sandals, an uneven haircut, those will protect you better than a shield. People trust what they expect to see. And in Rome, no one expects to be followed by a nobody. My teacher once asked me, "What do you kill with?" I listed the obvious: blade, rope, poison, hands. He shook his head. "No, you kill with presence, you kill with timing. A knife is only the punctuation at the end of the sentence. Everything else is grammar." I didn't understand it then, but over time it made sense. There's a moment just before a kill where the air changes. It thickens, tightens, you can feel it, as if the world itself holds its breath. That is the moment I lived in. You see, anyone can stab a man, but slipping past his guards without touching a single one, appearing beside him as if conjured from dust, that's the real craft. The audience must never see the curtain lift. I practiced walking behind people without letting my shadow touch theirs. I studied how footsteps echoed differently depending on the stone. I learned that the difference between suspicion and trust is often just a blink, if you hold someone's gaze too long or not long enough. There were days I said nothing at all, not out of discipline, but because silence became more comfortable than sound. Words are dangerous, they leave trails, but a look, a pause, those vanish in the wind. People think the most dangerous part of the job is the killing. They are wrong. It's the watching, the waiting. Spending days in a city, living beside your target, eating the same bread, listening to their laughter, watching them play with their children, knowing all the while that your hand is the end of their line. You start to see the pattern. The way people rehearse themselves. The way guilt makes them glance back and arrogance makes them speak louder. The truth is, no one is truly hidden, not from someone who knows what to see. At night, when my work was done, I would sit on rooftops and listen. Rome speaks louder in the dark. That's when the lovers argue, the drunkards confess, the powerful weep into their goblets. That's when secrets move through the streets like whispers carried on old sandals. I remember once standing behind a man for 2 whole minutes before he turned. He never heard me approach, but somehow he knew. Maybe the body always knows what the mind denies. He turned, eyes wide, not with fear, but with realization. And in that moment, there was nothing left to say. The quiet after death is not the same as silence before it. Before, there's tension, suspicion, a push and pull of choices. Afterwards, though, it's complete, still, like the city takes a breath again and forgets. Would you know if someone watched you in the crowd? I used to count the heartbeats before they did. I've had more names than I can remember. Each one was carefully chosen, soft on the tongue, forgettable in the ear. Some were borrowed from real men who died long before I wore them. Others were invented, stitched together from bits of gossip and guesswork. A few were gifted to me by those who never knew they were speaking to someone who no longer had a name of his own. In Alexandria, I was Marcus the copyist, a quiet Roman scribe with ink-stained fingers and poor eyesight. That was the story. I wore thin sandals and let my shoulders droop. I coughed often. People assumed I had some illness. They kept their distance. I was there to find a man who translated forbidden texts, works that questioned the divine right of emperors and the permanence of power. He lived above a spice shop, surrounded by scrolls and smoke. His voice was soft, his hands always moving. We spoke once, just once, about Cicero, I think. He quoted a line about truth. I remember thinking how lovely it sounded in Greek. The poison I used was slow, gentle. He died in his sleep with no struggle. The world lost another voice. And no one ever knew why. In Crete, I was Lucius, a traveling stonemason. I carried tools I never used and scars I couldn't name. I stayed in a house filled with laughter, children running underfoot, a mother who made bread that smelled like home. I was hunting a slave who had overheard something in the wrong house, plans, names, a conversation not meant for his ears. He was young, barely grown. When I found him, he begged me, not for life, but for understanding. Why? He asked. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He died in a cave by the sea. The tide took him, and I never went back to that island again. In Antioch, I was a priest of Mercury, or so they believed. I spoke the right blessings, mimicked the right rituals. I shaved my head, wore gray robes, and kept to myself. The city was a tangle of tongues, Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian. I picked up pieces of each, enough to slip through markets and sanctuaries unnoticed. Language is a weapon, too, a kind of camouflage. I lived in rooms that weren't mine, slept in beds still warm from strangers, drank wine under false names, and never stayed long enough for roots. My letters of instruction arrived by courier or not at all. Sometimes the target was clear, sometimes not. I learned to trust implication. There was a man in Ephesus, wealthy, generous, beloved by many. But he had written a letter, or perhaps only considered writing one. I was never told the details, only that he was dangerous to someone who mattered. He died during a storm. No one questioned the accident. Lightning, they said, a tree collapsed, a freak thing, but it wasn't the tree, it was me. You stop being a person after a while, you become a function. A silence. A shadow that moves only when needed. It's strange. I used to wonder if I'd recognize myself if I saw my reflection without the disguise. But the truth is, I never see my reflection anymore. I avoid polished metal, still water, clean glass, not out of fear, but because I no longer know what I'm looking at. Once, in a small village on the edge of Gaul, I posed as a courier recovering from injury. I stayed in a healer's home, a woman with strong hands and quiet eyes. She offered me herbs, simple food, space to rest. I lingered longer than I should have. There was no assignment, no name whispered into my ear, just time. She asked me what I had done before my injury. I told her I had worked with scrolls, that I had been a teacher. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. In another life, perhaps, we sat by the fire some nights. She told me stories of her childhood, of snow that came early and animals that sang at dawn. I listened, and for a while I forgot to pretend, but I left anyway. Before anything could settle, before she could ask for my real name, I didn't have one to give. The thing about wearing so many masks is that you start forgetting which parts are yours. Was I ever really afraid of dogs, or did I pretend to be once to appear harmless? Did I enjoy figs, or did someone else and I carried the memory by accident? Even my voice changed, depending on where I was, who I needed to be. In some places I spoke slowly, deliberately. In others I laughed loudly and slapped backs. I became the man you forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. That was the goal, after all, to leave no shape behind. Only an absence. Rome rewarded discretion, not glory. Glory was for generals, poets, politicians. My work thrived in the space between their triumphs. There were moments, fleeting ones, where I imagined a different path. A shop, perhaps, a family, a name that meant something. But then the next letter would come. Another mission, another identity. And I'd put the fantasy back on the shelf beside all the others, dusty, cracked, and no longer useful. I met others like me from time to time. We never spoke of the work, not directly, just nodded, shared a glance that said, "You too," and then moved on. Loneliness was part of the job, companionship was a liability, but even now I remember some faces, not the names, never the names. Just the curve of a smile, the twitch of a hand, the silence in their steps. Once in Carthage I saw a boy pick a coin from a fountain. He thought no one was watching, but I was. I smiled just slightly and turned away. I never told anyone. Some secrets don't need to be punished. Some shadows deserve to grow. By then, I'd stopped expecting a future. I existed only in the next task. The next city, the next lie. My past was fragmented, like pottery scattered across provinces. No one would ever glue it back together, but I kept moving. That was all I knew. And as long as I moved, as long as I wore the right face and said the right words, the world let me pass, like wind through an open window, gone before you feel it, gone before you name it. Antioch was supposed to be a short stay, just another city. Another name, another face borrowed from the endless shelf of borrowed selves. I arrived as a merchant's aide, silent, dutiful, eyes downcast. I slept above a granary that smelled of sour wheat and pigeons. The air in Antioch was always thick, humid in a way that made clothes cling and thoughts turn slow. She saw me the second day, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Her stall was tucked between a bread vendor and a man who carved charms from bone. She sold herbs, balms, remedies for coughs and sprains and broken dreams. Healers were common in cities like these, half worshipped, half ignored, but she didn't sell, she offered, and people trusted her. Her name was Lysandra. Her hands were strong, browned from sun and labor. Her sleeves always rolled high, her sandals always worn smooth. But what I remember most are her eyes, olive green, like bruised leaves in rainlight. They didn't shift away like most do when they sense something wrong in you. They rested, calm, certain. The first time she spoke to me, I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen in that strange, sudden warmth. "You've been walking with a limp," she said. "Right hip, it pulls slightly." She reached down into a jar and handed me a tiny, wrapped bundle. "Crush the leaves, rub them into the joint. Heat will help, so will not pretending you're made of stone." And just like that, I was no longer invisible. I didn't use the salve right away. I kept it in my satchel, unopened, like some forbidden charm, but I went back the next day. And the next. Sometimes I brought nothing. Sometimes I left with nothing, but she always spoke. Simple, ordinary words, questions, observations, the kind of talk people forget after it's done, but I remembered all of it. She once told me that people come to healers for wounds they won't name, that a cough is sometimes grief. That a limp is sometimes guilt. I wondered, even then, if she knew mine. There was a quiet between us. Not the silence of strangers, but the stillness of people who recognize something in one another. She never asked what I did, never pressed, just let me be, let me breathe. I started helping her now and then. Carrying baskets, fetching water, fixing a broken hinge on her door, small things, ridiculous maybe for someone like me, but they felt right. We shared meals, simple ones, lentils, bread, olives. She made a soup that reminded me of something I'd never had but always wanted. Sometimes we ate in silence, sometimes we laughed. Not loudly, but the kind of laugh that slips out when you're not guarding yourself too tightly. At night, I found myself listening for her footsteps in the corridor, the way her sandals scuffed the stone, the way she hummed absent-mindedly as she ground herbs. For the first time in years, I stopped sleeping with a blade under my pillow. She had a small window garden, fennel, mint, lavender. It overlooked the edge of the city where the hills began to rise. I once caught her staring at the horizon, hands dusted with soil. "When I was little," she said, "I used to think the sun rose just for me. Isn't that foolish?" I shook my head. "No," I said, "it still does." She turned then, looked at me with those olive green eyes, and something shifted inside me, something that had been buried so long I'd forgotten it had ever lived. I started dreaming again. Small dreams of mornings, of warmth, of someone calling my name, not the false ones, but the name no one knew anymore. I imagined staying, letting the other life rot away behind me like old leather, starting over. But Rome does not let its ghosts rest for long. The men came at dusk, 4 of them, faces hidden, blades quick, no warning, no ceremony, just violence. Cold, fast, practiced. She died on the floor of her own shop. Her herbs scattered, her blood dark against the stone. I arrived minutes too late. They were gone. The door broken. The air thick with crushed lavender and the copper sting of death. I knelt beside her, touched her hand, still warm. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even breathe for a while. They had come not for her, but for me. To send a message, to remind me who I was, what I was, that even softness has a cost. I found them within days, not because they were careless, but because I had learned to be something worse than patient. I didn't use poison. I wanted them to see me, to know. They died one by one, not quickly, not loudly, but with understanding in their eyes. And when it was done, I returned to Antioch and burned her shop to the ground, not out of rage, but so that no one would twist it. No one would turn it into something it wasn't. Her life wasn't a cautionary tale. It wasn't a mistake. It was real, brief, and it mattered. I never used the name I wore in Antioch again. I left it behind, like the scent of her garden, like the shape of her voice in morning light. From that day forward, I made a choice. No more homes, no more softness, no more olive green eyes. If you've ever lost someone who made you feel seen, then you understand why I never looked anyone in the eyes again. By the time I returned to Rome, the city had changed its scent. It wasn't just the usual rot of markets and sweat and stone baked under the sun. There was something sour underneath, like wine turned bad in the jug. The air crackled with unease, conversations behind curtains, people glancing over their shoulders mid-sentence. I could feel it in the crowds. Something was shifting, not suddenly, not with fanfare, but like a knife slowly pushed under skin, deliberate, silent, effective. My orders came more frequently now, no longer whispered by intermediaries or hidden in coded letters, but delivered openly, almost proudly. I was no longer a secret. I was a tool. They gave me names, reformers, philosophers, old soldiers who had begun to speak too freely, too loudly. Some were former allies of the Senate. Others were poets whose metaphors struck too close to home. A few were women scribes, midwives, priestesses, whose words spread faster than fire. I told myself at first that it was necessary, that I was maintaining the peace, protecting the Republic from its own unraveling. But deep down, I knew, I wasn't preserving Rome. I was shaving pieces off her and throwing them into the Tiber. The men I worked for changed their togas more often than their loyalties. They gave speeches about tradition while building monuments to themselves. They raised armies not to defend Rome's borders, but to protect their own ambitions. And behind every accusation, every arrest, every accident, there was someone like me. Not just me, of course, there were others. I saw them sometimes, in courtyards, in alleys. We passed each other like reflections in water, never acknowledging, always understanding. We were the quiet war. One of the first was a philosopher who had written too many questions and not enough praise. He believed in the people, in the idea that truth should be spoken plainly. He held public readings in the Forum, drawing crowds with his voice alone. They asked me to make him disappear, no spectacle, just absence. I waited outside his home 3 nights in a row, listened to his wife sing to their children. Watched him pace the upper floor, muttering lines to himself. On the 4th night, I entered through the back, stepped past a sleeping dog, and found him at his desk, writing by lamplight. He looked up, and just nodded. I didn't have to explain. He turned his head to the side, closed his eyes, and whispered a line I didn't recognize. Then I did what I was told. His scrolls were burned the next day. They said it was a house fire. Another time it was a general, retired, decorated, beloved by his men. He'd begun to speak against the rise of a certain figure, one who walked like a man but moved like a god in waiting. Caesar's name was not yet law, but it was gravity. And anyone who spoke against him found themselves falling. I visited the general as a courier, delivered a message that meant nothing. But it gave me a map of his villa, his habits, his guards. 3 nights later, he choked on his own blood beneath an olive tree. They said it was age. A cough turned deadly. The Senate gave him honors. A statue was raised. And behind it, a new law passed without opposition. I began to see it clearly then. The Republic was not falling. It was being carved piece by piece into something else, something harder, colder, quieter. The streets still bustled. The temples still rang with prayers. The games still roared. But underneath it all, people grew careful. Eyes shifted quickly. Smiles held too long. Fear had become the new foundation, and I, God's help me, I was one of the masons. They never said kill. That was too crude, too final. They used words like remove, silence, correct, and I obeyed, not because I believed, but because I no longer knew how not to. There was a woman once, a senator's sister, sharp-minded, sharper-tongued. She wrote letters, dozens of them, sent to allies across the provinces, letters that questioned everything. The laws, the taxes, the wars. She used metaphors that danced dangerously close to the truth. They told me to scare her, nothing more, so I waited in her garden, showed myself once, let her see the glint of steel. She didn't flinch. Just stared and said, "You must be very tired." I didn't answer. She died a week later. Poisoned at a feast, not by my hand, not by my order, but by someone else higher up the ladder who decided fear wasn't enough. That was the lesson. Even mercy could be a mistake. I started to dream again, not of hope, but of names, faces, voices. The people I'd ended, they visited in silence. Not to accuse, but to remind. Rome had never been pure, I knew that. The Subura taught me early that power and filth often shared a bed. But once there had been balance, debate, resistance. Now there was only obedience, and I, once a boy from the gutters, once a blade in service of silence, was helping to build the very thing I'd once feared most, a Rome that no longer listened. I walked through the Forum one morning, early. Before the vendors shouted, before the statues cast long shadows, I saw a group of boys playing near the Temple of Castor. One of them wore a wooden sword. He shouted, "I am Caesar." The others bowed. I turned away. That night I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to ask in years. What if I walked away? But Rome is not a city that lets go. Once you carry its secrets, they press into you like thorns under the skin. You can pretend not to feel them, but they're always there, reminding you who you are, what you've done. The truth is, Rome didn't fall. It was carved into new shapes by men like me. His name was Lucian. Barely 20, full of speeches and fire and ideals sharper than steel. He spoke with the kind of certainty that only the young dare wear openly. His voice didn't tremble. His eyes didn't lower. Even the older senators paused when he rose to speak, not out of respect, but out of unease. There's always something dangerous about a man who believes in something more than survival. They called him naive, but they listened. He wanted reforms, real ones. Land redistribution, limits on military command, protections for the poor. He quoted Cicero like a prayer and walked through the forum like he hadn't yet learned to fear its corners. I watched him speak once, not because I had to, just because he reminded me of someone I might have been. Then the order came, quiet, direct, remove Lucian, no explanation. No justifying rumor, just the name, the place, the time. I sat with the letter longer than I should have. Read the wax seal again and again. I knew who had sent it, I always knew, and I'd never questioned them before. But this time something cracked. It wasn't just his age or his voice. It was the way he still believed Rome could be repaired, not burned and reshaped, but healed. That word stayed with me. I hadn't thought of healing in years, not since Antioch. I followed him for days, as I always did, watched him dine, argue, pace. He lived in a modest home near the Caelian Hill. No guards, just a servant girl and a dog too old to bark. He walked to the Senate chambers with his scrolls tucked under his arm like armor. One afternoon, I found myself walking beside him. He didn't know me, not really. I wore the face of a government clerk, gray tunic, ink-stained fingers. The kind of man no one ever notices. You believe what you say, I asked. He glanced sideways, surprised. Shouldn't I? Belief gets people killed, I said. He smiled as if that were a compliment. Then we'd better be quick about making things better before we all vanish. That was the moment. I knew then I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't follow him again, wouldn't wait in the garden, wouldn't press the poison into his cup or the knife under his ribs. I returned to the place where I received my orders, a wine shop with a basement that wasn't on any maps. I told them no, that Lucian should be left alone. That there were other ways. The silence that followed was colder than any blade I'd ever felt. You don't refuse, the voice said from the dark. I just did. They didn't argue, that wasn't their style. The voice only said, you won't be warned again. I nodded, I left, and I started counting. Not the days, but the people. The ones who stepped further away when I entered a room, the messages that stopped arriving. The doors that once opened without a knock, now locked at dusk. They were marking me, not for death yet, but for erasure. The slow kind, the kind that makes you doubt your own steps. Makes you question the sound behind every wall. Lucian lived, at least for a while. I never saw him again, but I heard he passed his bill. Something small, mostly symbolic, but enough to echo, enough to make a mark. Me, I began to vanish, deliberately. I changed addresses, burned old papers. Sold the spare blades I no longer trusted myself to carry. I returned to the alleys of my youth, not as a boy, but as something older, worn thin. In the suburra, no one asked questions. I slept in corners, ate alone, spoke to no one. I'd become a ghost even to those who made me one. But I felt lighter. Strange, isn't it, to disobey the one rule that's kept you alive and yet feel less afraid than ever. I had spent so long following orders that I'd forgotten what it felt like to choose, even if the choice cost me everything. They never sent anyone for me. Not directly, but sometimes I'd notice things, a figure that turned away too quickly, a message that disappeared from a doorstep, the air shifting in a room where I sat alone. Rome had no need to rush. It preferred to watch its traitors with time, and I waited, not for forgiveness. That was a myth I'd buried long ago, but maybe for peace, or even punishment if it came with meaning. Lucian's words stayed with me long after his voice disappeared into the Senate walls. That stubborn hope, that refusal to surrender. I remembered being young. Once. Remembered chasing shadows and thinking myself clever for doing so. I remembered believing that silence was safer than truth. But even shadows can turn if they remember they once cast light. I hadn't redeemed anything, not truly. I had only refused to make it worse, and for a man like me, that was a beginning. They didn't come for me right away. That was the trick with Rome. It rarely strikes in anger, it waits, sharpens its knives on patience, lets you wonder if perhaps you were forgotten until forgetting becomes hope. And hope, as always, becomes the opening they need. But for a time, there was silence. After I walked away, after I said no, I became something between invisible and hunted. I slipped between names like changing cloaks, not to deceive, but to survive. My face, once trained to wear others, finally had to become no one's, not even my own. I left the city by night, barefoot, dressed in a cloak I took from a clothesline. I followed no road, only the gaps between torches. For days I moved like smoke, eating nothing warm, speaking to no one. My footsteps didn't echo. My breath came soft. Eventually I found refuge not in some distant villa or foreign land, but beneath Rome itself, in the veins of the old city. The aqueduct tunnels, the burial chambers, the forgotten shrines where light only visits once a year. The tombs were quiet, no one chased you there. Even the guards avoided the places where the dead whispered, and so I lived among shadows. Not as an assassin, not even as a man, just as presence, as breath. It should have broken me, but it didn't. I was no longer waiting for orders. I no longer needed to wear lies. For the first time, I belonged to no one, not even the Republic. That was freedom I didn't know how to name. I found a crumbling storeroom near the edge of an abandoned villa, half buried by moss and ivy, perched just above a dry creek. The stones leaned against each other like tired elders. But there was sun in the morning through a crack in the wall, and soil, just enough for a small garden. I planted lentils first, then radishes. Mint too, though I never liked the taste. I think I just missed the scent. The work was slow, honest. My fingers, once used to blades, now pushed seeds into damp earth. I kept my hands dirty. It helped. When I slept, they smelled of soil instead of iron. There were days I did nothing but sit, watch the wind move across leaves, listen to water settle between stones. Once I found a cat curled near my door. I didn't name it. It came and went. That felt fair. I taught myself to write again, not as I had in forged reports or false accounts, but in truth. I wrote on scrap parchment, on bark, on the backs of old receipts left behind by merchants long dead. I didn't write names, just thoughts, fragments. Today the mint sprouted. Rain came early. I slept without dreaming. I read too. A copy of Virgil's Georgics left behind in the villa's attic. His words felt different now, soft, rooted. They spoke of land, labor, and the quiet rhythm of days not broken by violence. One evening, I sat outside the doorway, watching dusk fold itself across the hills, and I heard birdsong. Not the frantic cry of city birds fleeing market shouts, but something gentler, drawn out, deliberate, a lullaby to the air itself. And I realized for the first time I heard birdsong without planning an escape. It sounded like forgiveness. The city still searched for me, I know that. Rome never stops watching its debts. But they looked in the wrong places, in alleys and ports and foreign inns. They expected me to run as I always had. They never thought to look for me where things grow slowly. I didn't trust peace, not fully, but I learned to live beside it. Each morning, I watched sunlight creep across the stone floor. Each night, I traced the pattern of cracks in the ceiling and thought of nothing at all. I stopped asking what I had become, stopped searching for old reflections. I was no longer a blade, no longer a whisper, no longer a man who vanished after the deed. I was just someone who tended mint, who listened to the rain, who chose silence not as duty but as comfort. When I passed others on the road, travelers, farmers, even soldiers, I lowered my eyes and nodded. They saw a tired man, a harmless man, And perhaps by then that was what I had become. I never spoke of Lucian. Or Lysandra. Or the dozens of names I'd erased like chalk from a wet wall, some memories I let fall away, others I buried gently like seeds, not to forget, but to let them rest. The price of mercy, it turns out, is not fear, it is solitude, but solitude, I discovered, is not always a punishment. Sometimes it is the clearest form of grace, and if they find me tomorrow, if this peace ends, then at least I will have known what it felt like to be still, to breathe without listening for footsteps, to lie down without a blade near my hand, to live for once without pretending. The candle has grown smaller, its flame no longer reaches the edge of the page, and the pool of wax beneath it is thick with spent hours. I've written slowly, as if pacing my own heartbeat, not out of caution, but so the night might stretch just a little longer. I don't know your name, I never will. But I've come to believe you're there, someone sitting in quiet, listening between the folds of time, letting these words find you like drifting ash. You may not know my name either. That's fitting. Names change, voices don't. This letter, it's not for Rome. It's not for the men who gave orders or the ones who now chase ghosts through empty streets. It's not for Caesar or the Senate or the statues that never blink. It's for you. I've told you what I can, not everything, not every silence, but enough to show that I lived. That beneath the armor, behind the bowing and the orders and the stillness, I was someone, a boy who chased dragonflies, a man who listened to poems, a friend who buried his dead with both hands, a son who remembered the way his mother folded robes long after her voice had faded from memory. There is no glory in this letter, no instruction, no lesson really, only a shape. The shape of a life carried carefully across seasons, not perfect, but whole. Somewhere not far from where I sit now, the city is breathing. Rome always breathes. Her sleep is restless. She dreams in the language of ambition and conquest, of echoes and marble. But she does not dream of men like me, not often. We are the forgotten ones, not because we didn't matter, but because we were never meant to be remembered. And yet here I am, scratching out my life in ink that once darkened the orders I followed. And there you are, listening, maybe even wondering, would I change it? That's a question I've turned over so many times it's smooth now, like a stone in the palm. And the truth is, I don't know. There were moments, brief but bright, when I was something more than a function, when I laughed without checking the exits, when someone saw through me and didn't flinch. I held those moments close, I still do. They were small mercies, and sometimes mercy is all that's needed to crack a man open. I didn't deserve Lysandra, but I remember her eyes. I didn't save Lucian, but I refused to end him. I didn't stop Rome from twisting itself into something colder, but I stopped twisting with it, and maybe that matters. You, who sits now in some quiet corner of your own life, maybe you've never followed orders with blood on them. Maybe you have. Maybe your ghosts look different, wear different faces, speak with different tongues. But if you've ever stood at a threshold and hesitated, truly hesitated, then you know what it is to be human. I spent years pretending I wasn't. I wore silence like a second skin. I became a tool, then a whisper, then something even less. But in the end, I came back, to dirt, to breathe, to the sound of birds, to writing. That's what remains, not the blade, not the coin, not the missions. Just these words, fragile as smoke, tucked into the edge of night, waiting for someone like you to carry them forward. You'll move on. As you should. This letter will end, the candle will go out, and tomorrow the world will not notice, but maybe, just maybe, you'll remember a line, a breath. The shape of a truth whispered by someone who once had no voice, not to change you, I wouldn't dare, but to remind you that every silence holds a story, and every shadow once was cast by something standing in light. So if you're still with me, stranger, perhaps I was not forgotten after all. If this meant something to you, leave behind a word in the dark, so I'll know I wasn't just a shadow. The candle burns low now. Its flame stutters against the weight of its own heat, rising, then dipping, then rising again, as if deciding whether to hold on for another breath. The wax has run in narrow streams down its side, hardened into crooked ridges like tiny forgotten roads. I've written what I could, not all of it, but enough. Enough to empty the pockets of my memory to place my truths, such as they are, into your hands. My fingers are stiff, the ink runs thin. The page is no longer crisp beneath my touch, but soft, almost damp with the sweat of this long night. I fold the letter slowly, carefully, as though speed might tear it. There was a time I rushed everything, footsteps, sentences, exits, deaths. But now there's no one to catch, no one to run from, only this moment. And the sound of a city just beyond the silence. I seal it with wax from the last of the candle. The imprint is faint, just a mark from the back of a spoon I once used to stir bitter tea. It's not beautiful, but it will hold. Somewhere above, Rome still breathes. You can hear her if you listen closely. The rustle of robes in a hallway, the soft laughter of a couple too young to fear the night. A merchant snoring behind his shuttered stall. A guard's armor clinking as he shifts his weight at the city gate. Life continues. It always does. And Rome, for all her cruelty, her grandeur, her appetite, has always known how to survive. Empires rise on her bones and fall at her feet. Statues crumble, names fade, but she endures. Loud, greedy, beautiful. I don't wish her harm, not anymore. She was my beginning and my undoing. She carved me and used me and left me hollow, but she also taught me to watch the sky, to move without sound, to recognize the power in stillness. And now, in this stillness, I give her nothing more. No revenge, no final blow, just a folded letter sealed with the breath of my last flame. The room is cool now, the walls seem to breathe with me. Each exhale a little slower than the last. I am not afraid, I am not waiting. There is no next mission, no sudden knock at the door, no name on a page, only the quiet, only the weight of sleep pressing gently behind my eyes. The garden outside, the one I once tilled with hands stained by darker things, is quiet too. The mint has spread beyond its bed, unruly but alive. The radishes came in crooked. The lavender never bloomed, but the soil was kind in its way. It let things grow. It forgave. That was enough. The cat hasn't returned in days. Perhaps it found another corner of the world to curl into. I hope it's warm wherever it is. I once thought death would come for me with a blade, quick, brutal, a mirror held up to my own work, but this is softer, like a curtain drawn slowly against the morning sun. I've left no heirs, no monuments, no name chiseled into stone, but I've left this, a voice. A shape carved in words, you heard it, and somehow that's everything. Let Rome forget me. Let the world continue turning with all its noise and hunger. Here, beneath it all, in this final breath of candlelight, a man lays down not in fear, but in peace. If you found this voice in the quiet, maybe it was meant for you. If you want to hear more lost lives whispered back into the world, let the silence know. Subscribe, stay, rest.